My name is Manfred Helber and I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. Azure Virtual Desktop is a really great technology, and we will first have a look at the architecture of Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure. If you are not familiar with the name, but maybe you have heard about Windows Virtual Desktop, then we are talking about the same topic, because Windows Virtual Desktop was renamed to Azure Virtual Desktop in the beginning of 2021. The idea behind Azure Virtual Desktop is to provide a remote access infrastructure similar from what we know from our traditional remote desktop services on premises. So there's a web access portal, we have diagnostics, we have a connection broker that ensures that a disconnected session will be reconnected as soon as the user has, again, connectivity. We have a gateway to optimize the connectivity and reach the resources. We have an Azure SQL database in the backend. So this is Microsoft managed. All these components here in this section in the middle are managed by Microsoft. For sure, to access virtual desktop resources, to use remote desktop access technologies, we need some clients. Microsoft is absolutely flexible in the type of client you use. It can be a Windows client, it can be some tablet with Windows, iOS, Android, it can be a smartphone. The operating system, Windows is fully supported, iOS is supported, Android, we have the HTML-based web access. So we are absolutely flexible regarding the endpoint we use to access these resources. What's important to mention, there are feature differences. So depending on which client platform you use, you will have different functionality in your remote access client, but you will always be able to use one of these clients to access via the technologies presented here your provided remote resources, and these remote resources can be desktops and this can be apps. So Azure Virtual Desktop provides us both options. Maybe you have heard about Windows 365. Windows 365 is, from the technology perspective, based on Azure Virtual Desktop, but it only provides dedicated virtual desktops per user. Here in Azure Virtual Desktop, we have the full flexibility. We can provide RDS session hosts based on Windows Server. They can be based on Windows Server 2022, 2019, 2016, and so on. We can provide dedicated Windows client desktops like we expected in an VDI scenario. We can provide Windows 10, Windows 11, and we can use an Azure-only exclusive feature. It's the Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session or multi-user. This is important to understand, because when you are thinking about the remote desktop session host, where you are usually using Windows Server as a target, then you are using a session virtualization. Many users access the same server, but each user has his individual working environment. Each user has his individual session there. When we have a traditional VDI deployment, each user has a dedicated virtual machine. You can imagine when you compare the resource demand we have in both scenarios, VDI will need much more resources, but we have a higher isolation level, so we can have absolutely dedicated individual virtual machines per VDI user. And regarding the application workload, the most important benefit of a virtual desktop infrastructure is that we can provide real client desktops. In an RDS scenario, With Windows Server, we provide a desktop for user workload, but from the technical perspective, this is a server desktop. And if you have a detailed look and comparison to Windows Client and Windows Server, you will realize there's a huge difference. Not regarding the optic, maybe a little bit, because actually at the client we have 11 and Windows Server 2022 looks different, but really regarding the release cycle, Windows 11 is released once a year. Once a year we have a new version. We have 24-month support for each version. So with Windows 11, it's clear that we always have an latest Windows Server client operating system. With Windows Server, we have 10 years support. So you can install Windows Server 2019 today and run it for the rest of the support period, or we can install Windows Server 2022 today and install it for the rest and use it for the rest of the support period without the need to upgrade it. So Windows Server on the one hand, long-term servicing channel, 10 years support. Windows Client on the other hand, semi-annual channel, modern lifecycle policy, regular updates that are provided by Microsoft. When we are thinking about apps, we have a lot of modern lifecycle apps that prefer a modern lifecycle policy. So it would be great to bring these two things together, to say, okay, let's use a terminal server with Windows Client. In traditional on-premises deployments, this is not possible from the licensing perspective. In Azure, this SKU is available. In Azure, we have a Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session that can be used in Azure Virtual Desktop to provide session virtualization for users on Azure Virtual Desktop target machines. So this means in Azure, Microsoft brings these two things together. On the one hand, the session virtualization, on the other hand, the usage of a real client operating system. We also have these other options to provide a traditional RDS host on Windows Server basis, to provide a traditional VDI deployment based on Windows Client, to provide apps via the app distribution policies. It's all available. Why is this so important? Let's have a look at the Office compatibility and Office support. Microsoft 365 apps. This is the subscription where we receive the Office apps for local installation with regular updates, is fully supported on Windows 11. We have a full support without any announced end date. This means as long as I update my Windows client and my Microsoft 365 application, I will have support for this combination. When we go through the list, we will realize, oh, Microsoft 365 apps are not supported on Windows Server 2022. This means if our RDS host in a traditional on-premises deployment is Windows Server 2022, we don't have the Office support on this RDS host for Microsoft 365 apps. But for sure, we have it for the Office LTSC apps that are available via volume licensing on the traditional licensing ways. This is very, very important to understand that we have relations between the lifecycle policies between the client OS or the host OS and the installed application. In the past, it sometimes was possible to bring together long-term servicing channel like we had it in Windows Server 2019 and modern lifecycle policies like we had it in Microsoft 365. And Microsoft stands with and for this made support commitment. But from the technical perspective, this doesn't make sense. To say on the one side, I want to have a server I will maybe never update for the next 10 years. And on the other hand, an application that receives monthly updates. And this is the reason why Microsoft in the future will be focused more on bringing together the compatibility for modern lifecycle apps and operating systems on the one side, and on the other side, the compatibility between long-term servicing channel OS platforms and long-term services channel applications. So with this knowledge, you will realize, oh, with Azure Virtual Desktop, I can provide a Windows client desktop with multi-session, with full Office support. So let's say a terminal server based on Windows client with full support for Microsoft 365 apps. Now this means in the past and also today that you have to migrate your virtual desktop workload to Microsoft Azure data centers. There are several scenarios where the customer will not decide to do this or where we have technical limitations. And this is the reason why it's a great news that we will have Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI in the future. Here we can see the stack is the same. We have the Azure Virtual Desktop, let's say platform and infrastructure components managed by Microsoft in the Azure data centers. The diagnostics, the broker, the gateway, the SQL database. We have the same client compatibility, but now important, the VMs that provide the desktops and or the apps, they are not hosted in Azure. They are hosted on our Azure Stack HCI. And our Azure Stack HCI can be provided in our own data center. So let's have a look at how this is configured and how the user experience looks like. I will connect to an Azure Stack HCI cluster where I already prepared the Azure Virtual Desktop configuration. Because to configure it completely, we would need several hours. It's a little bit complex today. I assume Microsoft will work on an easier way to configure it because today it's in preview. We have a documentation for it, but these are many manual steps to provide Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. But it works great if you complete these steps. If you invest the time, it works really great. And we will have a live demo walkthrough through what I have configured to give you an impression what's necessary to do to have this Azure Virtual Desktop functionality on your on-premises Azure Stack HCI. First, I connected to my Azure Portal, and maybe you have Azure Virtual Desktop already there. If not, you can search for it. So you can search for Azure Virtual Desktop, Azure Virtual Desktop, and then it will be here in the list, and you can open it. The first step when you start new is to create a host pool. So we will create a host pool here, and today it's not possible to configure Azure Virtual Desktop from within the Windows Admin Center. If you go back to the modules where I explained you the capabilities of different hybrid services, you have always seen we were starting in the Windows Admin Center. We were starting to enable Azure Arc, we were starting to configure Azure Monitor, we were starting to configure Azure Backup. Here for Azure Virtual Desktop, we have to start in the Azure Portal. Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI is actually in preview. So this means what we can see here is the final version of Azure Virtual Desktop, but the implementation on Azure Stack HCI is in preview today. So I will select the Microsoft sponsorship subscription I have here. I will use a resource group I already have. We have this Azure Stack HCI resource group. I want to use it. And I have a host pool name. Let's name the host pool name Azure Stack HCI AVD03. I have already several of these deployments, and this is the reason why I will add this 03. I want to select for West Europe for the location. Then we have a question if this will be a validation environment, yes or not. This means in a validation environment, changes are not immediately published. So I have to decide to publish them later. I will decide, no, this is no validation environment, so I will use this in production. Host pool type, personal or pooled? This is the important question. We don't decide for the operating system here. This is the next step. But personal means each user that connects to this Azure Virtual Desktop infrastructure has its own desktop on a dedicated virtual machine. If we choose pooled, then we can decide how many users will share a machine. Let's choose pooled because pooled is this thing where we have special functionality in Azure Virtual Desktop. The next question is breadth first or depth first? Should the algorithm first put as many users on a machine as possible or as I have configured? Or should the algorithm first deploy as many virtual machines as possible and put one user on each virtual machine and then put a second one? Depending on this choice, you will have different situations regarding the costs, different situations regarding the possible workload and the user experience. I will decide for depth first. I want to ensure that my resources are first consumed before new resources in Azure are allocated, because this is running on virtual machines. These virtual machines are running on premises on Azure Stack HCI. Today we don't have information about the costs for it, but there will be costs that have a relation to the number and the size of the virtual machines. This means I will try to ensure when I want to work cost optimized to run or to disable not used virtual machines to reduce costs. So to run only the number and amount of virtual machines I really need. Number of sessions, session limits per virtual machine, let's say maximum 10 virtual machines. So I'm in the Azure Portal. The next question is configuring virtual machines. Add Azure Virtual Machines? No, I will not add Azure Virtual Machines because I want to provide the virtual machines on my Azure Stack HCI cluster. Okay, then in the next step, we have the workspace, register desktop app group, so we can add an application group to a pre-existing workspace. I could say, let's choose one, or no, I want to create a new one, a new workspace. This is also possible to say, let's create a new workspace, and the workspace name is the Azure Stack HCI AVD workspace 01 or 03. Okay, we have a new workspace. We have advanced settings, we have tags, and create and review. Let's review the settings, and then this Azure Virtual Desktop host pool is created as an empty object without any virtual machines in there. The next step is to download an image from the gallery from Azure. This can be done via command line with an ASHCI. So there's a tool to copy or download resources from Azure, and I have to download this Windows 10 or 11, depending on what you prefer, Windows 10 operating system or Windows 11 operating system, the multi-user version. When you downloaded this machine, you can publish this machine to your virtual machines on your Azure Stack HCI cluster. I did this with one virtual machine. So I downloaded this virtual machine from the Azure Portal, this Azure Virtual Machine template, and I published this one to my environment here, to this Windows 11 AVD VM01. When I click on this machine here, I will see the settings. It has 16 virtual CPUs, 32 gigabytes of memory. I will connect to this machine. It's a virtual machine, but not installed manually. This would be possible if you will use a Windows Server or a Windows Client image, but I wanted to have this multi-session version, and so I published, or I downloaded the image from the Microsoft Gallery and published it to my host and deployed the virtual machine here. Let's check what's in the virtual machine. So now you can see I'm connected to this virtual machine, the Win11 AVD VM01. I'm connected. Here at the bottom of the screen, you can see this activation message. This is actually a known issue in the preview version of Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. You don't need to care about this here. And when I go to the, let's say, I will check the control panel here. I'm logged in with a local administrator. Then I want to go to the control panel. And in the control panel, we have the programs or the installed applications. And there we can see there are a lot of things installed. And we have this Azure Connected Machine Agent. We already know this from previous modules. This is for Azure Arc, so this machine is also Azure Arc enabled. We have the Edge browser here. This one is typical there. We have FSLogix there. This is part of the image provided by Microsoft. And we have the remote desktop agent bootloader, services infrastructure agent, services network stack, and so on. And these things have to be installed manually. So you install these connectivity tools on your virtual machine on premises, and this will connect these machines to Azure Virtual Desktop. When I check a prepared host pool I already have in my environment, let's go to the Azure Virtual Desktop settings here and the host pools. Then I can see this is the host pool we created together. This is the host pool I prepared for the live demo. Let's go to this host pool here. So similar configuration. And here I can see I have virtual machines. And this virtual machine is exactly the virtual machine I have on premises. I will showcase this to you in a few minutes. So when we go back to our on-premises Azure Stack HCI environment, we have been connected to the machine. I will open another tab to be able to show you something else here and to keep the session open here, because we will need this session later. And when I reconnect here, it's my user. I will use the administrator in this session with his password. And I will use these credentials for all connections. Then we can see on this machine here that in my cluster, this cluster here, it's an Azure Stack HCI cluster. When I go to the virtual machine section, and when I select again this virtual machine we are actually working on, And then I will open the details page, so the settings or detailed information about the virtual machine. Need the inventory of the virtual machines. This one is my Azure Virtual Desktop VM, and I will click on the name of the virtual machine. And here you can see this is Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session. So the version is not correct here because it's Windows 11 Multi-Session, what I downloaded here and what I installed here. There's something going wrong with the versioning, but the important point is it's Enterprise Multi-Session. This is an SKU you will not be able to buy on premises. It's not sold anywhere. It's only available in Azure, and because Azure Stack HCI is Azure, you can use this edition there. So what's important in the Azure Portal to ensure that somebody can connect to this environment, we need an application group. And the application group, you remember, we also configured this in our AVD03 deployment. And in this application group, we have the so-called assignments. And in the assignments, I can see the list of names of users that have access to this environment. To ensure that this works, we need a hybrid configuration for our Azure Active Directory. So this means if you are running Azure Virtual Desktop natively in Azure, you can join the virtual machines to Azure Active Directory only and work with Azure Active Directory only users. In my scenario, I have the situation that, for example, this user MH, so my user, the Manfred, is part of the local domain manfredhelber.de, and this local domain is connected via Azure Active Directory Connect to Azure Active Directory. So this is also required to configure this hybrid scenario to ensure that the authentication will work. Let's see how the user experience is. We had on the slide an URL rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/arm/webclient/index.html. I opened this URL here in the browser in a private browsing session. We can see this user, it's the user MH we have seen, has access to several Azure Virtual Desktops. I will use the one here in the middle. I will connect with this user via the web client. We can use an RDP client we install locally. There's an app for smartphones and tablets, and I will use the web client. It's a very comfortable way because usually we have a web browser everywhere. On a tablet, on a computer, on a non-Windows computer, so I'm absolutely flexible. I have to authenticate here because I'm in an isolated session, so I don't have single sign-on inside this session. And now I can see I have a Windows 11 client desktop. Now the question is, where is this machine running? How can I find this out where the machine is running? So let's try to find out via File Explorer, for example. Let's go to this PC. Let's go to Drive C. And let's check if I can create a new folder. Let's create the folder MH. This worked. This worked because I didn't restrict it here. If you're wondering why does this work, this user I'm using here is a local administrator without any restrictions to be able to show you everything. Let's check what we see on my Windows Admin Center in the connection we have here. Let's also go to the File Explorer and let's have a look at the Drive C. And we can see, oh, there's a folder MH. Let's create a new one. Let's create an AVD demo 2022. This is created by the admin here on a local machine. I'm not connected to Azure. I'm in my virtual machines here on my local Azure Stack HCI deployment. So let's switch to the Azure Virtual Desktop session. And here we can see this new folder just created in the other session. And for sure, I'm multi-session capable. There could be another user connected to this machine and the next one and so on. And this is the great news about Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. Let's say this is the modern remote desktop scenario for on-premises, where I only see advantages compared to traditional remote desktop services. What's important, the traditional remote desktop services are still available. This doesn't replace anything. But this is a new opportunity that's great from the technical perspective, and I would absolutely recommend to you to showcase to your customers, to get familiar with it, and to use it wherever it's possible. If you are running traditional RDS hosts on premises based on Windows Server, this is possible with Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, with Windows Server 2016, 2019, 2022, but with the mentioned limitations regarding the application compatibility when it comes to modern apps. In Azure Virtual Desktop, in Azure and on premises, it doesn't matter if you have Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI or Azure Virtual Desktop in the Azure data centers, you always are free in the choice which operating system you use for the desktops, servers, clients, for sure only supported versions, and you also can provide apps. So we have seen the configuration of Azure Virtual Desktop in the most important steps. We have seen the user experience. Now we come to a very, very important point for Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. The name for it is short path. Because for some customers, a reason for looking for Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI is to just have the workload on their own systems. To be able to access local file servers via the local network connectivity. But let's think about how the communication from the client to the virtual desktop works. For sure, the client, we can see the client here, has to authenticate. The client will authenticate via Active Directory domain services because the client where we access the resources is part of the local domain. With the Azure Active Directory connectivity and the Azure Active Directory Connect, we have a hybrid authentication. So we use our local client, we use our local user, but we have also our access tokens for the cloud resources. The client connects via public internet to the RD web website. This is what we have seen, what I have done. The interesting thing is the client can also use the RDP client app. And the RDP client app is required to have the full short path functionality. Now what happens? The client connects to the remote infrastructure in the Azure data center. And RD short parse says, oh, dear client, we have a session host where you have a more efficient path to, because the session host is in your local environment where you are located. How is this recognized? There's a group policy setting object where we specify this short path configuration, and the client needs a direct connectivity to the session host provided as an VM on Azure Stack HCI. This can be realized via ExpressRoute. This can be realized via client VPN, This can be realized via site-to-site VPN. This could be realized, but please don't do this, in publishing the virtual desktop VM to the public internet. So it's important that this machine is directly accessible for the clients. So I think you watched this video from all over the world. In Germany, we have a very strong history for VPN connectivity. So I assume that most of the German customers will decide for VPN, client VPN or site-to-site VPN to ensure that this connectivity here for RD short path exists. And then when it exists, the client is redirected from the remote connectivity via the public internet to the short path. And I think this is absolutely clear, understandable. When we have this redirection, we have lower latency and higher bandwidth, because I don't need the asynchronous internet connection I usually have. I don't have the limitations of my internet provider. Here in Germany, we often have limitations in this internet connectivity because of asynchronous connectivity with unlimited upload speed and so on. We can fix all these issues with short path when we are running the desktops on our Azure Stack HCI environment on premises. So this is a great opportunity. As I already mentioned, you can test all this. It's a public preview, but today we don't have the pricing for Azure Virtual Desktop because it's in preview. So if you test it, if you try this out, you have no additional costs except the costs for Azure Stack HCI. And what you have seen in my live demo, and I will switch again to my live demo environment, I created a virtual machine with more virtual CPUs and a larger amount of memory, because Azure Virtual Desktop lives from CPU and memory resources. And for sure, you can also add GPU resources. If you have GPUs in your physical server, you can provide these physical GPUs for your Azure Virtual Desktop workload and optimize this workload. But if you don't have GPUs, not every server is capable to provide GPUs. GPUs are sometimes limited in availability, and they are not absolutely affordable in each size. And if you don't really need them, because maybe you don't have an high graphic workload, but you want to have an optimized performance for your application workload, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on, then you could also decide to use more virtual CPUs, more memory to optimize the user experience. My experience is that additional cores are absolutely helpful to have a good experience here in the remote connectivity on these machines. So this module was about Azure Stack HCI and Azure Virtual Desktop in combination. We will update this module when Azure Virtual Desktop is released, so then you will have new information there when Azure Virtual Desktop is released on Azure Stack HCI. Today, everybody can test the preview